With women, when they are violent, this may sound strange, but there's a kind of wish for comfort and control. It's particularly confusing because the mother may harm her child, but then really wish to be the savior. So having sometimes for some women feeling the only way to have a voice is to inflict harm.
Welcome to the Brad Carr Podcast. My guest is Anna Motz, former president of the International Association for Forensic Psychotherapy, author of The Psychology of Female Violence, Crimes Against the Body, and her newest book, If Love Could Kill, The Myths and Truths of Women Who Commit Violence. Anna Motz, what do we need to know about your background to understand your expertise in the psychology of female violence?
So, Brad, great to be here. And I am a clinical and forensic psychologist. So I did my training in clinical psychology and I specialized in working with offender patients. So people who'd come into psychological services through committing crimes. I then did a further forensic psychotherapy training and psychoanalytic psychotherapy training. So that meant I was really trying to address the unconscious as well as conscious motivations and thoughts, wishes, dreams, fantasies that lead to really quite unusual or violent crimes.
And how do dreams play into that? That's not something I've heard much about.
Well, I think when you look at someone's unconscious, the dreams they have can be very revealing of the conflicts that haven't yet come into their conscious minds. And sometimes people, particularly people who become very unwell, can't really distinguish between dreams and reality. So if I were working with a patient, I would be thinking with them about the early childhood experiences, their memories, and also their dreams, because they would be letting me into some of their prevailing preoccupations that maybe weren't coming out in their daytimes, but were in their daytime experiences, but were really percolating overnight.
So what happens in the dreams that connect to violence? I'm wondering if dreams can predict violent behavior or if a pattern of dreams suggests that someone is violent or will be violent again.
Well, with a patient I was working with in forensic psychotherapy, if they were telling me about a recurring dream, that would not necessarily predict what they were going to do, but it might really be important in understanding what was frightening them, what kind of figure was in their mind as someone who was persecuting them, what kind of early trauma they had that was being replayed in their dreams. So I wouldn't have a magic interpretation, but I would be asking them, so what comes to mind when you tell me about this dream? And how do you know when you wake up that you're not still in the dream? So it can become a really important source of information about the person. And actually, I would be doing that I also have a private psychotherapy practice where I see people like you and me. People often do talk about their dreams and what it means to them. So it's a very helpful source of material in order to get to know someone and get to know what most frightens them, what most haunts them, as well as, yes, what they might want to do.
Okay, so the dreams are a tool for you to better understand the mind of the person, but not necessarily predicting violence, or would there be a relationship to, say, someone having a dream about doing something violent and then actually acting it out?
I mean, it can. They can have a particular dream, maybe where they're persecuted. And then in the therapy, we would address who it was, who they thought this persecutory person was. And if, for example, it was a previous abuser, maybe a father, a stepfather, or a mother, a sister, a girlfriend or boyfriend, and that dream revealed to them something very important that had happened in their life. If they were then determined to kind of get revenge on that person or someone who seemed like that person, that could be an important predictor because it would show me what kinds of emotions they were preoccupied with and also what kinds of fantasies they had in their daily life. So people will come along in a forensic clinic, and sometimes they have fantasies that won't lead to action, but really worry and disturb them. And other times they have fantasies that include plans of how they're going to go ahead and take revenge through harming someone else or even killing them.
Okay, so you could have the dream and it could be something that sort of works into something like a fantasy and it becomes maybe something to act on, but for the most part, you're using it as a tool.
Absolutely, as a tool to understand the meaning for the person. So people who have had lots of physical and sexual and emotional abuse in childhood can, for example, whether it's in the forensic clinic or in the psychotherapy, ordinary psychotherapy practice, these dreams can show me and them how frightened they still are, how on edge they still are, how they don't trust other people, and how they feel that the only way to defend themselves against further harm would be to carry a knife or retaliate in some way. So they're very important tools to let people know what goes on in their unconscious mind, to bring it to consciousness, and then to think about, is this a fear, or is this something that you think is still, is this a memory of the past that this dream represents, or is it something you're still experiencing on a daily basis in your waking life? And are you carrying a knife? And are you imagining that everyone you meet in the street has some kind of wish to do you harm? So yeah, I think it may not seem like an obvious tool, but I think people's dreams, people's associations, as well as their memories, as well as how they relate to me, these are all really important means of understanding an individual.
And so it's important then to ask them what it means to them. So that would require a good deal of awareness internally in your patient to recognize their sort of own internal private language, their own sort of system of symbols and what that means. And then you have to trust them to know that about themselves and to be honest with you.
Well, so the Freudian method of dream analysis would just be what comes to mind. What's the association? So no, you don't have to have come in with a pre-rehearsed or determined. Some patients love to do that because they find it interesting and it's clever to say, I had this dream and I think it's about this and that. But most people will just come in and say, oh my God, I had this horrendous dream where I think it was my mother and she was chasing me down the street and then I ran in front of a bus. So you would just say, so what comes to mind? And the mother in the dream she might represent the new partner who they feel actually there's something dangerous about them and it's going to lead to harm. So they don't have to know before they come into the room, but I suppose people need to be open to thinking about the meaning that their thoughts, fantasies, dreams, slips of the tongue, whatever feelings they have when they come into the room, all of it is really important data.
You mentioned slips of the tongue. So a Freudian slip would be relevant data?
It could be. It might be it might just be a little gaffe, but in my mind, if someone calls me, by the name of their hideous boss or terrifying girlfriend, I say, oh, I didn't mean to say, I don't want, it's like, well, what's happening in the moment with me here that makes you think maybe I'm not this kind and trustworthy therapist? Maybe you are feeling threatened or alarmed by me, and let's think about that. So what you're doing in therapy, including forensic psychotherapy, is you're using the relationship all the time as a kind of microcosm for a mirror for what goes on outside.
Okay, so you have all of these tools, and then you're an expert witness in child custody cases. So how would you make an assessment for a situation like that?
So in a child custody case, I wouldn't necessarily be looking at people's dream life unless they told me and it was felt important to them. I would be looking at the patterns of their own early experience, how actual behavior, of course, what had actually happened with the child, and then their attributions and thoughts and feelings about their children and that child. So the database for what I would be addressing would be much more about patterns, repeated patterns from their own experiences, so attachment patterns from early life. But if they were having recurring dreams about this child, they're wanting to kill this child or this child is a monster, I wouldn't just say, okay, that dream means you're a risk. I would say, how do you feel about that dream? How does it relate to the child in front of you? And what we know is that the literature does show us that when parents have very negative attributions about their children's behavior, when they find it really difficult to feel empathy for them or understand what's going on in their minds, that can be a risk factor for child's abuse and neglect.
The inability to understand the child, the lack of empathy for the child.
What we would absolutely, and attributing malevolent intentions to the child. So the kind of language they use, their understanding of what you and I might see as quite ordinary childish behavior. The parents I've worked with, both in family assessment services and child custody cases, will often have very concrete, definite, sometimes quite inaccurate when you actually meet the child. So attributions to the child of them being deliberately malicious or trying to wind them up or whinging and moaning and whining and carrying on to manipulate. So there's a whole language about how these parents understand their child's minds. And there's also some evidence that if you can improve their kind of capacity to understand their own minds and their children's minds, that the risk of abuse and neglect can be reduced.
But what if they're right? I mean, some children are manipulative.
Well, I think all children we all do things to try and survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if a child cries or falls over and then comes running over to you for cuddles and comfort, it would be, I think, quite understandable for us to think the child is trying to get care and comfort from their caregiver, rather than to think this child is putting it on and feigning distress and manipulating the parent to get some, undeserved attention. So it's not that children and adults we will do everything we can to get our needs met, but it's whether the intention is seen as somehow deceitful and malevolent and not to be trusted. A really good example of that with the parents whose children were on the at-risk register in the service I worked in was exactly that, asking them what happened when a child fell over. Did they comfort them, or did they think the child was just clumsy, bad, stupid, manipulative, needed to man up? And but all of this has to be seen. These are just, building up a picture of a parent's understanding of a child in the context often of behavior that has already demonstrated significant harm to the child. So those custody cases I provide expert witness for, they're always, the child has come to the attention of either the police or social services or doctors or other health professionals because of significant harm or evidence of neglect. And from that basis, we try and understand why and how this happened. Did the parent just not understand their child? Was the parent mentally ill and delusional, believing the child was actually posing a threat to them, or were they reenacting their own abuse history? Do they have any capacity to repair what's happened? How damaged is the child? What's the attachment like between them? So it's a huge, complex area. But thinking about how they talk about the child and how the child responds to them when we observe the attachments and observe their behavior, that's all part of building up this complex picture.
And you're an expert in female violence. So what in these patterns would be unique to females?
What would be unique to females? Well, I think that sadly, abuse and neglect, are found in both men and women in relation to children. But what I particularly am interested in, and what I see happening more with the women that I work with, is a kind of narcissistic relationship to their children. So the woman will see the child as a extension of herself in a very particular way. And this can be even more striking when the child is also female. So like a mini me. And for some of the women I work with, for example, certain of the really disturbing behavior like fabricated or induced illness is more often perpetrated by mothers than by fathers. And it does seem to reflect this kind of sense of the child as an object, as a part of the mother, and as a means for the mother to attract the attention of medical services and to present herself as a very caring, very dedicated mother through harming her child, presenting the child to medical services, being seen as a kind of heroine, but actually being the perpetrator of potentially fatal harm against her child.
And this is what we would call Munchausen's by proxy?
Yes, that was Munchausen syndrome by proxy was the historical term and has now been replaced by fabricated or induced illness or factitious or induced illness.
And what would cause a parent to do this? I mean, I guess the idea that it's a sort of self-absorption is one explanation, but is there more to it?
Well, there's a significant proportion of the mothers who go ahead and either deliberately inflict harm on their child so it looks like they're ill, or present their child who isn't ill at all with made up illnesses. We know that they themselves have more than the general population also been subjected to this kind of abuse in their early lives, or have presented themselves as Munchausen syndrome, not Munchausen syndrome by proxy, for unnecessary medical attention. Certainly the mothers I've seen who display that kind of behavior have, unsurprisingly, disturbed personalities, histories of childhood deprivation and neglect, but also a narcissism, a real desire to get care and attention for themselves. So very disturbed relationships with these abused children. I suppose the most graphic case was really in Dee Dee Blanchett and her daughter, Gypsy Rose, Gypsy ended up murdering her mother, but she had been presented for years in a wheelchair, used to gain not just tremendous sympathy for her mother, but also to get lots of money for these made up illnesses, the cancer treatment. So yeah, Dee Dee Blanchard was really, really ultimately killed as a victim of her daughter's revenge, I would say, but herself displayed unbelievable levels of disturbance and what seems to be perversion and cruelty along those Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
So you shared some sort of details of that case. Could you walk us through what was actually happening?
So what was happening was, from a very early age, this little girl was being presented to medical services with a whole variety of illnesses that she didn't actually have. So seizures, blood disorders, I believe. Then she was presented by her mother as having cancer. She had her head shaved as though she had cancer treatment. She had teeth removed. Her mother got her teeth to be removed as evidence, I believe, of the seizure she was supposedly having. And so this child was very much paraded as this terribly tragic little girl, and her mother was afforded tremendous sympathy and care, and there were all kinds of special, the kind of attention that a very ill child and a loving, devoted single mother might receive, with lots of publicity and campaigns to help her, and special devices to help her make her home beautiful. And then it turned out this was pretty much entirely fabricated. And this little girl, I think it all turned when Gypsy became a sexual adult, and her mother really responded very badly to that. So she didn't want her daughter to have any independence. She didn't want her daughter to be a fully separate, subjective sexual creature, and really controlled her in a very coercive way, practically confining her to the home, but parading her as an example of her own devotion and heroism. All a big lie. And in the end, Gypsy and her boyfriend murdered mother. And there's been quite a few documentaries. But I've worked with mothers and fathers in those couples, but primarily the mothers who almost become addicted to the care and attention of the medical services and are using us, whether it's therapists or doctors, as part of their weapons against these children, and children who can walk being put in wheelchairs and given, protective helmets when they don't have seizures. And because the parents, most of us in society trust parents. And if a parent comes into a clinic or an emergency room and says, my child is having a seizure, or my child is, turning blue, we expect that they are an anxious parent whose child is having a terrible, potentially fatal episode. We don't think this parent is deeply disturbed with potential murderousness and has made up a situation that is completely false, and where medical intervention could actually be a tool for doing further harm.
So if this woman can deceive the medical system for so long, how confident are you when you deal with people about the role of deception in your own patients?
So can you say a bit more about what you're meaning?
So I'm just imagining, if somebody really wants custody of their kid, they could deceive you, or they could try.
Absolutely. I mean, there are many ways that parents can be deceptive, and there can be false allegations of abuse or neglect when there are custody battles in the private law cases. And those false allegations of abuse, are particularly pernicious. Then there are parents who will minimize the harm they've done, or present very idealized and quite unrealistic descriptions of their children. They're good as gold, they're perfect, but you've got the evidence then of injuries or failure to thrive, or children who appear extremely depressed and anxious, bedwet way beyond the time one would expect them to be continent, go to school with bruises, unexplained injuries, are very, very thin and malnourished. So in terms of how we detect deception, as I was saying earlier, it's never just meeting a parent without, when I'm doing a childcare case, I'll have huge documentation from many, many professionals outlining the child's behavior, outlining if there have been police investigations and concerns, multi-agency meetings with teachers and nursery nurses and doctors and health visitors. But in a forensic interview, I will be challenging parents about how they can possibly reconcile these evidence of injury and harm and statements children have made with their own description. And these cases often take quite a long time and involve various sources of documentation. And also sometimes, and this is very interesting because I have been caught out a couple of times where I've believed a parent, and it's been very sobering. So particularly twice working with mothers who were absolutely swearing blind that they realized their partners were abusive and they had left them, and they were putting the needs of the child first because children were being caught in the crossfire of domestic violence or witnessing really horrific scenes. And this was emotionally very damaging as well as potentially physically damaging. And in one of those cases, it was covert surveillance that detected that the parents hadn't split up at all. that mother was still engaged in a relationship with the partner who seriously injured her child and her. So it was interesting because while I could see that the man was violent and not changing, she presented such a convincing picture of understanding and love for her child. And I suppose that was quite early on in my career, and I still had an idea that women were much more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence. So she fitted that very classic picture of a vulnerable young woman who had been caught up against her will in this violent relationship. And of course, there may still have been coercive elements, but she knew full well the consequences of remaining in that relationship. In fact, they abducted their child when she was on a contact visit. It was a big police chase, but it was also the covert surveillance of seeing the videos of him entering her home.
So after you have that experience and you realize more about the deception that can happen with people, how do you go from there with that new knowledge?
Well, I suppose that particular experience made me realize, firstly, that psychological evidence is only one part of the picture, and I'm not, I always knew I'm not omniscient or omnipotent, and sometimes in courts we're asked how likely is it that even though mother has left or father has left this one violent relationship, they'll get into another one? How do we know they're really putting the needs of the child first? So that particular experience, I suppose, led me to be perhaps more cautious in my recommendations. So in terms of, is a child going to be removed from the monitoring and reviewing of social services or child protective agencies there and then because a parent says they've seen the light and they're getting out of violence? Or do we have a continued period of monitoring? Also, what kind of psychological work would that mum have been prepared to engage in? So then I began to be able to work a lot more with both perpetrators of violence and victims of violence. And then over the course of a therapeutic period of time, one is able to feel more confident about actual change. And using lots of sources of information, never saying my opinion is sacrosanct and 100% reliable. But I can, if a mother or a father has had several incidents of children coming to harm and children being removed from their care, that is a red flag. And unless something has changed very dramatically, one has to be cautious. As my court reports always have to specify it, the welfare of the child is paramount. And that when you're working with, say, mothers and fathers who've been terribly deprived and hurt themselves, you can see the victim in them. It can be tempting to forget the perpetrator in them and forget that you're actually having to ask very, very clear questions about risk. I should also say there are some risk measures that are helpful as well in they're not, again, standalone measures, but measures of personality, measures of levels of aggression, as well as all kinds of data related to police convictions, which are certainly extremely helpful in showing you just how dangerous this individual can be.
You mentioned perpetrators and the victim in them, which I definitely do want to unpack further. But first, you mentioned that you're assessing, it sounds like, readiness for treatment as well. So how could you be sure of that? How relevant is that? And I think maybe the sticking point of some of what I've heard you talk about with violent females is that we have a hard time really accepting that females can be violent to begin with, and then it becomes hard to treat them. So how does that all play out with the readiness for treatment?
So absolutely, it can be very difficult to, first of all, even believe that a woman can be violent, let alone a mother, because of our really deeply held, stereotypically cherished, notions of womanhood and the sacred role of mothers, Yeah, and my mentor and dear friend Estella Weldon has written this wonderful book, Mother Madonna Whore, which is all about how nobody could believe that a mother could sexually abuse a child. So first of all, being presented with a woman, a mother who's harmed a child or is being accused of or found to have neglected a child can require even seasoned professionals to take a step back and think this lovely, gentle, sometimes very scared looking person in front of me could actually be violent. That's really important to first, I suppose, one of the first ports of call is to confront one's own prejudices. Then considering a risk assessment, one would be doing, as I've outlined, a whole very, very careful fine-tooth comb of all the documentation, all the harm and suffering, which can be very, very difficult reading, actually, that's come to the child, then doing really thorough histories of the mother in this case, looking as well as at medical histories, psychiatric or psychological presentations, history of police involvement, and being really quite robust, not being just sympathetic and kind and touchy-feely about, oh, you've been through such a hard time, and being seduced at times by what can coexist with significant harm to a child is the mother's absolute passionate declaration that she loves this child and would do anything for this child, or complete and absolute denial that she's been involved in harm. So one has to do really, really thorough interviews. And what's most helpful in thinking about readiness for treatment is, of course, whether that parent can acknowledge any areas of difficulty, any areas that they feel they need help with. And it doesn't always have to be a frank confession to child cruelty or neglect, but something about their own feelings, perhaps of inadequacy. Some mothers have felt with this burden of having to be this brilliant, naturally good mother that they failed, that their child hates them. Postnatal depression, being in a terrible, toxic relationship while giving birth and then feeling trapped. All of this can lead to particular feelings about motherhood, particular terrible feelings about the child who has trapped you, children who are products of rape. So like I was saying in the very beginning, thinking about all the different attitudes, feelings, conceptions of the child, impact of the child on the person's life, and really the person's capacity to reflect on themselves and to be able to say, I think I'm not a perfect parent. I would like help. I do need help. Not I've harmed this child and I'm a monster. That's not what we're asking for. When I worked in a service in the UK for several years where we offered parents of children who were at risk of harm or had been harmed treatment, we would have quite a prolonged assessment period to see whether they were interested, they accepted at least some responsibility for their children having been harmed. Wasn't a prerequisite. Were they willing to come along? Are people willing to come along every week, do some really quite difficult work, face what they often think of as a very, harsh judgment by people who couldn't possibly understand what it's like to be in their shoes. So therapeutic readiness also involves the therapist being very persuasive and compassionate while also holding a clear line that this work is essential if they're going to be left or able to do one of the most responsible and challenging tasks in the world, which is to be a caring parent who doesn't allow their children to come to harm or inflict harm on them.
Mm-hmm. What would a close call look like? What would be a case where you would be sort of on the edge of a decision, and how would you work that out?
That's a great question. And I think, again, this is more perhaps of an art than a science, and people sometimes rely on their countertransference, that is, the feelings they have about someone, rather than on what could be a more, objective, compassionate, but realistic assessment of the person sitting in front of them.
Mm.
So I think sometimes people who are very articulate and eloquent, people perhaps with whom the therapist identifies more closely, they can appear, what we might say, talk the talk, but don't walk the walk. So they look like they're doing treatment or ready for treatment, but in fact, they're just keeping the therapist at bay with lots of beautifully articulated sentences, giving the person what they want to hear, and actually going home and being really abusive or quite deceptive. What's really interesting to me is I think that there are unconscious biases that operate all the time. So like I say, if the person is perhaps well educated, middle class, perhaps white, perhaps a similar age to the therapist, unconsciously or without proper interrogation, a therapist might be kind of seduced into thinking, oh, this person's like me, they're okay, which is really, that's prejudice and that's dangerous. But we know in the criminal justice system in the UK and the US that being a person of color will lead at every stage to unconscious bias and more assumptions of aggression. So I don't know how directly that carries over into child care proceedings and child custody cases, but I imagine that that is also a prevalent bias, so that somebody who seems, maybe very different from the therapist or who gets prejudicially classed as more aggressive based on some aspect of their cultural identity, could be seen as less trustworthy than somebody who looks more like, a white member of the upper middle classes, for example. So I think that's it's really important for us to be very closely supervised and to try to interrogate our biases, both conscious and unconscious.
Mm. And what would a closed case that you've had look like? Have you got an example maybe in mind of something where you were kind of on the fence and then you came to a decision?
Um, yes, I think one of my first cases was very much like that. It was quite a unique situation in that. So I was very early on in my career and I was assessing a young woman. And so she'd had quite a difficult time in her early life with lots of chaos and disruption in her background and poor schooling, unfortunately. And she had a dual heritage child, which a member of her family was very prejudiced against. And that child was taken into care. And then she got pregnant with another child who was also dual heritage, and she went to prison for burglary. I saw her in prison in a mother and baby unit, and she was amazing. She was like the best mother the unit had seen. She was really loving to this baby. He was, I think, about 9 months old at the time, and everyone waxed lyrical about her. And she was really confessional with me about all her mistakes and the horrible racial prejudice of the member of her family and how she had learned all these skills that she hadn't naturally had and, from her own history of being parented. And so I went to court and we all testified that she should, that this child should remain with her in the mother and baby unit, and that upon her release, she would be living alone with him. And unfortunately, and I was really passionate about believing in her and not wanting to have her past necessarily dictate her future, particularly given that within this structured environment, she did brilliantly. But what happened was almost as soon as she was released from custody, she went back to all kinds of antisocial associates, including family members, and went back to leaving her child with people who were known risks to children, and just couldn't quite resist the draw of her own life. So that wasn't even a close call. That was a mistake. And it really taught me a lot about having to be very, very clear about the social circumstances of the individual rat, not just how they present. And in that case, the immediate, very structured, very, very caring actually that unit in a prison gave her a sense of being parented and guided. And of course, there were many fewer opportunities to leave the child. So that was really quite a tragic case. And I think, the child was adopted, and that was a good thing. But I then had to see her again for yet another baby, and she was in a mother baby unit, and she was telling me everything had changed and she'd learned her lessons. And I could see that this pattern was really repeating.
Well, this sounds really tough. This gets at something that seems to be a theme with a lot of issues with certain types of crime. I'm thinking people get addicted to drugs, and then they can move to a different city, get away from that drug scene, and maybe have a better chance of recovery. So, how much do you think about environment? How much influence do you or the system have on the environment when, say, a violent female is going to get out of the system and go back and maybe have custody of that child?
So there are many different questions there. So I think the social environment's really important, obviously. And some of the cases where I have seen tremendous, unexpected and really positive developments have been where a woman who maybe has been in that kind of very toxic environment, maybe the partner in a crack den and partner prostituting her and lots of drugs and alcohol. And then one woman, again, who I worked with, she was a very young woman, and she went into a foster home, which was really interesting. So she was there with her baby, and she was, I think, 17. And so this quite religious family were actually fostering her as well as her baby. And so that was an example of a social environment that could be different. There are all kinds of community centers and support networks that women can be helped by, supported by, contained within. But ultimately, if you're seeing someone in prison, it's very difficult to know what they will be going out to.
Yeah.
However, in the prison where I currently work, there's a lot of contact with family members, and that's a very important part of the consideration. Very few women get to have custody of their children while in prison, and certainly only up to a certain age. So it's often family members who are taking care of those babies, toddlers, and older children. But going back to the question about a close call, there have also been cases where I feel women have been maligned unfairly and given up on when they, for example, have transient psychosis, which can actually be medically and psychiatrically treated. And once they are treated and have very careful follow-up and support, they're able, with extended family or partners, to provide care for their children. So while it's important, the close calls can go both ways, giving up on someone who actually has capacity, as well as believing in someone who's disguising and covering up areas of real risk and danger.
And we talked earlier a little bit about this idea of the perpetrator as the victim too. So then the story that there is around a person becomes probably part of how you see this trajectory, I'm guessing. I'm more familiar with things in cults and thought reform situations and things like that. But one that comes to mind for me is I've had some correspondence with Janja Lalich, who does this sort of expert witness work with cults. And there's a case where a woman killed her baby while in a cult. And the expert would say, well, when the woman is out of that cult environment, she will not be a threat to her child. Her mind is sort of captive, And when she's out of the cult environment, she'll be much safer to society in general. But the woman was given a life sentence instead. So there's this frustration sometimes around understanding where the person comes from and where they might go after treatment. But also, it can be used, I think, as sometimes a justification that isn't necessarily merited. So it's tricky to define how important is the victim story of a perpetrator. I wonder what you think about how to navigate that.
Yes, again, that's a really central question. So in terms of my model of forensic psychotherapy, victim and perpetrator coexist. So it's a false dichotomy to think that there's, we thought this was a perpetrator, really it's a victim. I would say even the person who's in a cult had accessed some aspects of her own aggression, even though she was coercively controlled or victimized. So there's still work to be done. And equally with perpetrators, there's often perpetration because now they're in the position where the former victim part of them, the child or adolescent who's been harmed or even adult who's been harmed, can now somehow retain or reclaim a sense of power. But this time someone else is their victim. So they project that victimized, helpless part of them. It's what Anna Freud called identification with the aggressor. And in a very simplistic way, bullied children can become bullies. So the victim and perpetrator, I believe, always coexist. And it's important not to get drawn too heavily into siding with one or the other. The person in front of you needs to be able to think about their susceptibility or receptivity to being victimized and how to protect against that, as well as their own capacity to become a perpetrator. So the cult situation is very interesting because while I would certainly agree that being in a cult means one is giving up all kinds of agency and executive functioning in terms of making decisions and making realistic appraisals about choice. Having had that experience, one, unfortunately, is more likely to find another kind of coercive partner or situation, unless there's really robust psychological work to rebuild the person's sense of agency and confidence in themselves. And I've certainly worked with individuals who were in cults, and one as a victim later of coercive control was just like primed to have someone impart all kinds of very, very frightening apparently spiritual beliefs into her mind and shape her behavior in ways that were really destructive to her and children. And in another case, a perpetrator of child sexual abuse had himself been in a kind of cult, and all really, really perverse behavior had become normalized. So I think just leaving the cult isn't enough.
Yeah, there would have to be other treatment as well.
Absolutely. And real recognition, not just of what has been done to one, but the bits of oneself that have accepted it, continued to normalize it, found in some ways, perhaps it was even, sounds like I'm blaming victims and I'm really not, but a kind of almost comfort in being guided. And of course, we know in cults, people don't realize they're being coercively controlled. They believe. And that's part of the tragedy. That I do believe people can actually make recovery, but it can be a gradual process.
So you said that victim and perpetrator are not necessarily dichotomous, that they're sort of overlapping. This is a conundrum I think that fiction gets at really well. If you watch a series like Mindhunter, for example, one of the questions that it seems to wrestle with is how important is it to have empathy for serial killers so that you can catch serial killers? And it's a theme throughout the show. The police who don't really grasp it, they don't seem to have as much success. And then the FBI guys who are on the cutting edge, they're having more success. When you think about that sort of question, how how are you weighing it? How much do you want to have empathy for a perpetrator? And what about people who are seemingly just bad people, just dangerous people, and maybe beyond some sort of connection?
So again, I think this is a fascinating question because one can have empathy for the person, a person sitting in front of me who has suffered, while having little empathy for the deeds for that person's violent, sadistic, murderous aspects. So you can really hate what they've done. And what's so interesting as a forensic psychologist and psychotherapist is I guess we get quite used to hearing about really awful murder and torture and rape. It's never comfortable. It's always distressing. But some of my colleagues, and even I've had this on occasion, when you're hearing about an animal who's been tortured, that hits a different level. And I think it's because we're just not as used to hearing about it. And it's the vulnerability of that creature, which, by the way, we know that animal cruelty is a very important um, correlation and predictive factor for violence in families and violence perpetration. But to have without empathy for the person who's sitting in front of you and who you have to work with therapeutically, I guess, like in the Mindhunter situation, you can't engage them in really a way that's going to allow them, I think, to reveal more and more of themselves and to demonstrate what it is about them, what it is about their history, what it is about their distorted views, what it is about the horrible things they've done, which admittedly are horrible, that has given them satisfaction or joy. But it's understanding, I think, is the most important thing. And understanding or having empathy for the victim inside the person. Sometimes it's possible to have empathy for the perpetrator, particularly when they've, say, killed the person they most loved because they were mentally ill, psychotic. That is probably my worst nightmare, that I would lose my mind and end up doing something like killing my own child or partner or mother. So I think you can have empathy when the suffering is so evident to them. At the same time, you're not condoning their action or forgiving that's not my remit. But without having some real emotional engagement, and it's very hard. You have to imagine what it would be like. One of the worst things for me is working with child sex offenders, because suddenly I had to think, oh my goodness, people are attracted to children. And thankfully I am not, and have not been, but to have to imagine being attracted to a child is extremely disturbing. So the empathy has to go to, here's this person who often has felt unloved, ugly, unwanted, unable to function with adults, for example, it's a caricature. And in that situation, they have a very distorted, quite wrong and harmful approach to children, and get these feelings of being gratified and wanted and desired by a child. Now, that doesn't mean I would condone that ever, but by understanding what it is, the kind of self-hatred or loneliness, or even if it's just a sexual gratification, I have to be able to know that that's what the person is experiencing, and not condoning their behavior ever. So I don't know if that's really empathy or a kind of imaginative engagement with what's going on in the person's mind, the psychological functions it serves for them. The difficulty is, of course, in order to get there, you sometimes have to hear things that are really horrific and disturbing. And I think my colleague in Leicester, David McMahon, described it best when he said it's like the floodgates of hell, the gates of hell have opened and they can never be shut. Yeah. You'll have these images now that you have to somehow, not even images, but, truth about what some very, very disturbed people, hopefully a minority of humanity, what they do. And very unbearable scenes that get created often in domestic situations, though not out there in wartime or in terrorism acts, but in intimate partner situations within families, what you could call a kind of domestic Holocaust.
Anna, with your work, it seems that when it comes to this question of empathy for violent offenders, you especially want to address the challenges of empathy for female violent offenders. What do you think are the challenges there? What do you think are the effective approaches?
So, empathy for female offenders, I think, is essential. The trauma histories of most of the women I have worked with in custody, in community settings, in other aspects of criminal justice, they're traumatic histories that are beyond what I have encountered in other adult mental health settings. And so, again, never to condone the crimes, the acts of neglect or cruelty or, robbery or harm to vulnerable victims. I would never do that, but I do understand how the experiences and the self-perceptions and the criminal associates of the women, so their trajectories of risk, where for example, the adverse childhood experience literature that shows that the more of these adverse childhood experiences one has, the greater the risk of further experiences happening across the lifespan. So being taken into care, being abused or neglected physically, emotionally, sexually, then not getting your education, then dropping out, maybe a very early pregnancy, violent relationships, homelessness, poverty, all of that intersects. So the empathy is essential in order to try and understand that this isn't like someone is born evil. I don't believe people are born evil. And certainly the women with whom I work almost invariably have had trauma that has very unfortunately directed them. Now, we can all have trauma and not go down criminal or violent paths, and that's very important to remember. So the challenges with women, I think, are particularly that unlike men, when women are violent, the people who are most likely to be their targets are extreme self-harm, so harm against themselves, harm against their children, and that's a particularly emotive area that the women will be more likely to turn to intimate partners or their children as their nearest targets of violence, and that's the kind of female perversion and narcissism cycle, but also because women aren't nearly as dangerous out in public in gangs as men are, and they oftentimes their kind of realm of power is still domestic, so it's the people around them who are most likely to be their targets of violence. It can be really difficult to empathize with someone who's harming very vulnerable creatures and beings like children or elders or animals, as I've said. So the other challenge is the stereotypes we have, as I mentioned earlier, and it was really shocking for me to sit with a woman who was cruel and sadistic. One patient I worked with who was pretty terrifying, and she would delight in telling me how she would harm her neighbor's cats and how she quite self-consciously or knowingly would threaten to kill herself, would stalk her partner to check whether they were seeing someone else, how they would make all kinds of disparaging comments to their children. So really a level of cruelty that I, as a woman, found difficult to imagine. And of course, all of us have had a mother. And so there's a huge taboo around motherhood and believing that women can be this cruel. I think women have tremendous power in the domestic realm still, despite gender equality battles. So when I'll never forget seeing a woman in a supermarket like literally punch her child so hard, and we all just stood there in shock. I don't know that anyone did anything.
Hmm.
I went over to the store detective. What was that going to do? But it's that real shock and fear. Some of the most awful childcare cases, like Victoria Cumbier in England, a young girl brought over from the Ivory Coast and actually tortured by her great aunt. The childcare professionals were so kind of seduced by this elderly woman, the great aunt, and her story of pathos and her need for care, that the injuries to the girl were almost overlooked, as well as the fear of appearing, prejudiced against her. But to then, when someone has, as you asked me about earlier, when people have been deceptive, when they have covered up, when a woman I worked with was secretly giving her child poison, how can one separate out empathy for the very damaged person inside this perpetrator from empathy for their victims? So I found it almost impossible to work with mothers and their children in the same room, because I could see the damaged child in the mother and then she could be my patient. But if I saw, as I had, the woman who poisoned her child also blamed this little girl when she headbanged and stood there and didn't comfort her and said, see what I mean, she's off. That, to me, that was a challenge to my empathy, where I thought I find it hard to see a parent who's abusing a child in front of me. I think.
So how do you draw the line then? I'm wondering, because let's say we have someone who's done these sort of terrible, violent things, and then you could say, well, if I see a pattern, then that's a problem. But if not, and I see the potential for treatment, then we can try to walk this back. But let's say you see a pattern, but then, well, where does the pattern come from? If it's from this person having been through all sorts of trauma before, then maybe we can treat the trauma that underlies the pattern, and so forth. So how do you decide how far to walk it back, and how much credit do you give to nature, to genes, things like that?
Well, I think walking it back, therapy would only be part of the picture. So there would have to be really stringent risk management. If someone was so traumatized and they were reenacting this trauma with their child, and we could do lots of therapy around their trauma and understanding their child is separate from them and dealing with processing their own, post-traumatic stress disorder and their self-hatred and their aggressive feelings that needed containment. We could do all that work, and then I would have to observe, or somebody, it may not be me, would be observing how the child and parent interacted, how the child did in other situations, what the child said. Obviously, welfare officers interview children. So, and there would be lots of support around that. So that would be part of walking it back. But there are certainly cases where I would say this person, whether mother or father, is so damaged and has inflicted such harm already that even if they get to the point of being able to deal with their own impulses, they cannot be trusted not to inflict further harm or neglect on a child. That's just putting. And actually, some parents, including some Munchausen's parents, actually express relief and say, I'm glad I was caught and stopped, because a part of me really didn't want to be doing this. Or equally, a mother in child care proceedings will say, the best thing I could do for my child, even though I'm devastated, is to have her or him adopted, because I know I can't do it. So there's something about truth and honesty and trying to defeat a very sentimental, happy ending kind of wish. Genes, that's a huge question, but certainly when you're looking at, predisposition to mental illness, that isn't something that one would necessarily say would preclude the possibility of good enough parenting. I loved Winnicott's idea about good enough good enough mothering, don't have to be perfect. So what other kinds of genetic expressions were you thinking?
Well, I've spoken with Dr. Robert Plomin, who has a similar saying about parenting. He says he's a behavioral geneticist, and he says parents matter, but they don't make a difference, which is to say that as a parent, you could really do terrible things to your kid. You got to make sure that your kid is fed and, taken care of and everything like that. But you're not going to make your kid into, probably an elite athlete unless their genes are already in place. So parents matter, but they don't make a difference, is what he says. And also he says that he's found, genetic correlates with things like personality disorders and stuff. We've started to touch on words like narcissism, antisocial. I haven't heard you actually talk about personality disorders and that sort of diagnosis too. So I wonder about that as it relates to genes.
Sure. Well, there is, as you say, a genetic, component or increasing research looking at the evidence for a genetic transmission of personality disorder. I, as a psychologist, believe that's a component, but that's certainly life experiences and social and environmental factors really play a huge part in whether or not those genetic, perhaps predispositions manifest as actual personality disorders and traits. But but it's a complex interplay. Certainly children who are raised by mothers who are classified as having personality disorders or difficulties, it's a very controversial kind of diagnosis here in the UK. People are really railing against it. I still think it has real utility and it can be very helpful for people themselves. Some people hate being classified with a personality disorder. Others find it really helpful as a way of understanding their own difficulties. But we know that parents with personality disorders or difficulties need support and help, and their children will need support and help. And we don't want there to be just a kind of reenactment or transmission. So I believe very much in the, diastasis stress model, that there are vulnerabilities, but that those vulnerabilities or genetic predispositions don't have to manifest as full-blown conditions if there are sufficient safeguards and counter agents in the environment.
What was that model that you described?
A diastasis stress model. So it's kind of vulnerability underlying. It's like why you and I might both be exposed to someone with COVID, but I would develop it because have a weaker immune system, or I'm a smoker, which I'm not, and you won't because you're a superb athlete with a fantastic immune system. But so we're both exposed to something, but we both don't develop the condition. And equally, when you look in families where there are parents, maybe disturbed parents or parents with particular mental illnesses, and one child somehow, you could say, well, they weren't genetically loaded, but you could also say with twin studies, people have the same genetic predisposition, but don't go on to develop the same personalities or the same illnesses.
You used the word loaded there. So this is a model that's sort of representative of the idea that people say something like nature loads the gun, but nurture pulls the trigger.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's really very, a very neat crystallization of my many words there.
Okay. I borrowed it from someone else, I'm sure.
Well,
so how did you get into all of this, this particular topic, the female violence and things like that?
Well, you probably have to ask my psychoanalyst that, but certainly I love forensic work. I'm fascinated by it. I think the social aspect of our work is just incredible. It's really important. I see people that I wouldn't have seen in the ordinary outpatient clinic. And so my first encounter with forensic patients, which was also quite psychodynamically oriented in the clinic, but I was meeting people from, walks of life that lots of men who wouldn't come into the outpatient clinic or go to their general practitioner for help. And the women I met were particularly kind of neglected and startling in terms of their crimes. many of them mentally ill, who had committed really tragic crimes like the ones I describe in my book, where children are killed out of delusions or parents are, but also women who had been victims of coercive control in horrifying ways and then went on to take revenge either on the perpetrators of the violence or others. So I think it was because I was fascinated by this field, and I suppose in my own background, my parents are both Holocaust survivors, so I was very interested in how ordinary people can do really evil things. That was my kind of go-to question, whether or not I'd articulated it to myself. Going into places that I wouldn't usually have gone to as a psychologist, so going into prisons, seeing the kinds of systems taxpayers support and create, making all kinds of inroads into understanding the impact of poverty, racial discrimination, cultural and religious discrimination, and kind of stigmatization, all those different social factors, as well as a huge range of psychological and psychiatric difficulties, all kind of coalesced when it came to doing forensic work, and particularly with women and mothers who so much of their violence was going underground and not being recognized, not being acknowledged by the women themselves or by society, which was then sending really dark and deviant impulses even further underground. So this seemed to me an area of huge importance, and I luckily felt able to engage with most of the women that I met and really wanted to understand, their histories and how they had come to become perpetrators of these offenses, and most importantly, how and if there was a way of helping them to recover.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you are. It seems rare. I don't talk to many people about female violence, so I'm glad that you're doing the work. One thing that I've heard you talk about is a difference in motives. With women, with female violence, what do you think motivates the violence? I've heard you say that with men, it's probably more about power and status, but what about with females?
I think with women, when they are violent, there's often, this may sound strange, but there's a kind of wish for comfort and control and a sense of being absolute. I mean, in that sense, it could be construed as power, but it feels like it's a real desperate attempt to get rid of a feeling of being so isolated and so alone and so terrified, and to feel, I guess, a sense of being alive and having some kind of, making some kind of mark on the world, having some means of control. And sometimes then in Munchausen's cases, it's particularly confusing because the mother may harm her child, but then really wish to be the savior.
Mm.
And that gives her a tremendous sense of comfort. But it's not social status. It may be a kind of sense of not being helpless. And also, most importantly, because of the trauma trajectory, really the trauma that's being expressed, getting rid of that feeling of being absolutely helpless and invisible and silent. So having, sometimes for some women, feeling the only way to have a voice is to inflict harm on another person. Sometimes, paradoxically, it can be a kind of cry for help. I've worked with women who've harmed a child, and that's the only way that attention was drawn to the fact that they were being absolutely brutalized in their own home, as was other members of their family. So I see it very much as a communication and a need to relate. Even though that may seem counterintuitive, it has a function and a meaning.
Mm. And the title of your book, how does it relate?
So the title of my book, If Love Could Kill, Stories of Female Violence and Forensic Psychology, is really about the most the most tragic of cases, which is where mothers who are mentally ill kill their child out of a delusion, out of a wish to save that child. And this is a theme that I explore in the book alongside other cases where what was a loving relationship, say with a partner, has become coercive and life-threatening, and then the woman flips and takes back the power, but in a fatal act of murder. So killing and love are connected, and the absence of love and the wish to kill are also connected. And that's really what I explore in the book. I hope in a way that isn't just about the most extreme cases, but also talks about the whole continuum of trauma, feelings of violence and despair that can't be articulated or even owned or even seen, and then get expressed through bodily acts of violence, sometimes even in acts of violence against the woman's own body and self-harm, but ultimately as a way to try and draw attention to the fact that women have aggressive impulses, that when they are hurt and suffering or, driven mad by dangerous obsessions, they can enact violence, and we desperately need to understand and treat it in order not just to protect the women, but to protect the people who are in their care, their children.
Mm-hmm. And how does the self-harm connect to all of this?
Well, women have these violent impulses and are told they can't express them. So from very early infancy and childhood, we know that girls tend to internalize distress, whereas boys are kind of encouraged to. And again, you could argue there's a genetic or natural disposition, but boys will externalize. There'll be fights, there'll be rough play, whereas girls tend to become a bit more depressed and internalizing. And even when the women and girls I work with have been, feel really outraged and angry, it's safer to harm themselves, to cut themselves quite violently, to strangle themselves, to burn themselves. I won't go into all the unbelievable numbers of ways that women and girls, it's a big problem in the criminal justice system and in other institutions, and also in the community. I work with many privileged girls and women who do find that when their feelings become overwhelming, they harm themselves. And it can be protective because they're not harming others, but it's also can be very, very damaging psychologically to themselves as well as, physically. So I see it as another means of communication using the body to try. The hope is that someone will respond to this very overt sign of distress and rage and be able to help the person put it into words and manage those impulses and feelings.
This is reminding me of a conversation I had on borderline personality disorder with Dr. Karen Jacob from Harvard. And the self-harm is a theme in her work. And I just wonder if we're talking about using self-harm as a cry for help, using one's children as sort of pawns to get attention, this narcissism in mothers, how seriously do you take people who are going to use others to get the attention that they want? How much consideration you give to them, especially if you are going to get into a therapeutic relationship with them?
Well, I think it's simplistic to say that they're using others to get attention. I think that their disturbances are being reenacted with people, perhaps their children or perhaps medical professionals. So they're trying to get their needs met. And I take people's desperate wishes for understanding and care really seriously. I don't feel people communicate, people have tremendous suffering that they want relief from. And the more desperate people are, the more they haven't had financial, social, educational, occupational resources, the more desperate their means are to try to get their needs met. So I take the underlying wish for care. And also, I believe as a forensic psychotherapist, that people who commit crime actually, there's a part of them, as Freud wrote, criminals from a sense of guilt. The guilt is often driving them, the sense of being bad and needing punishment. So many times people actually want to be caught and stopped and punished. I'm not there to punish them, but I am in the service of stopping the antisocial destructive behavior and helping them put into words what's really causing them this unbearable pain.
This seems to really assume a lot of credit for people when it seems to just shoot right past what would seem very clear on the surface, which is, no, somebody does a crime to get away with something. They steal because they want to steal the thing. They self-harm because they want to get attention and look what you made me do and put that on others. Or they harm their child and then bring the child to the doctor so that they can get attention from the doctor. I mean, I've talked with experts on manipulation, and one thing they'll talk about is how it's very tempting to want to give people this extra credit. Like, you can say that people are in denial when actually they're just not accepting that people are going to hold them responsible for something. But we put these psychological terms on it, like denial, and then it becomes seen as something different. I mean, how do you cut through that and find what is truth? Or are you always going to give people the benefit of the doubt?
I don't think I always give people the benefit of the doubt, but I think that human beings come into the world with a whole mix of wishes and feelings and beliefs and needs, and that the way that they are treated and develop and the way they present in the world has many, many different components. And the people I work with in forensic services come from the most socially, culturally abusive and deprived and hideous environments, including extreme poverty. And oftentimes the kind of criminality isn't a function of being a bad egg or a bad seed or an evil seed, but a function of how they have learned to survive. Now, clearly there are people who have more or less degrees of, deviousness, but I want to understand them. I don't think people are fundamentally bad. I think there are people who can't be helped and people who, there are a subsection, I would say quite a small subsection of the people I see who could be classified as psychiatrically sociopathic. And a small percentage of people really just shouldn't attempt treatment because of the kinds of situation you described. But the women I've worked with and the men mainly I've worked with have not come to me in order to get attention or care or put the wool over my eyes. Obviously, there are external motivations like being able to leave jail or being able to stay with your partner even though you've been violent. That obviously, but also the Münchausen's women are often very, very disturbed as well and repeating patterns. Not just the doctor addicts, and most mothers who harm their children are not doing it in a Munchausen's way. It can be in the context of intimate partner terrorism, depression, drug addiction, mental illness. So I'm not just some naive, fluffy, evangelical person who thinks everyone is really good and we just need to give them a hug. But I do think that we need to understand the roots of human destructiveness, and also keep in mind that most of the people, well, certainly most of the people I work with, have a whole complex interplay of victim and perpetrator aspects. And there's a part of them that doesn't want to be bad.
And you use the phrase intimate partner terrorism. I've heard you use that in other interviews too. What is that?
So that's the kind of intimate partner violence where it's the perpetrator terrorizes, really has, we call it domestic tyranny. So they control every aspect of their partner's life, including financial, sexual, physical, all the domains. And they stalk them and they don't let them dress as they want to. So every particular domain, it isn't just a case of, not to trivialize it, but it isn't simply violence occurring every now and again. It's a kind of complete control or attempt at complete control over all these different aspects of their partner's lives and children's often too.
Hmm. And earlier you mentioned that you point to the background of a lot of the people that you meet and that you work with. If you were to see this in a person from, say, an outstanding, affluent, comfortable background, what would you think there?
I mean, I have worked with people from affluent, comfortable backgrounds, but that doesn't preclude all kinds of psychological disturbance or even parental abuse. Affluence. I mean, in England, we have public schools which are private schools where children as young as 5 and 6 are sent, and parents believe it's a really wonderful, privileged educational system. But quite a few of the people I've met who've survived those systems have had all kinds of experiences of feeling abandoned, isolated, harmed. I suppose suffering and violence are on a continuum. I think certainly having financial resources is helpful, but it doesn't prevent someone from becoming very disturbed or dangerous.
So is suffering...
Sorry.
You please.
No, I was saying some of the most chilling people I've worked with have been affluent.
Yeah. It reminds me of scenarios in a book by your colleague Gwen Adset, where there are definitely cases like that. You're saying suffering and violence on a spectrum. So do you suggest that suffering is necessary for someone to precipitate violence?
I don't think it's necessary. No, it's not necessary. But I'm just saying we can talk about suffering even when you're affluent and apparently very well cared for. And there are certainly anomalous cases where I've worked with people you can't see all the typical, you can't see the trauma. There isn't a trauma. That's obvious anyway. You can't see deprivation. You can't see the socioeconomic features that characterize most of the forensic patients. And those particular patients or prisoners are often very much disliked because they're almost seen as though they have no justification. But it can be, a very unfortunate twist of personality, or I think you're trying to say, aren't there people who are just evil?
I do wonder in your experience.
So there are people who I feel are untreatable. I suppose the term evil, there are people lots of people I've worked with have committed evil acts.
Yeah.
I haven't met a person I would call an evil person. And even the people who've committed evil acts, this is what's so confusing. That might be, 2% of their personality or 2% of their lifetime. And it's horrendous and you can't forgive them that. But 98% of the time, they're just charming and nice and kind and play with puppy, a bit like Hitler. So it's a very confusing situation.
Yeah. There is so much nuance that you bring to this, and thank you for doing that. Before we get to our last topic, where is the best place for people who want to learn more from you to look for you online?
Well, I suppose it would really be through my book, If Love Could Kill, where I've written all about these kinds of cases. I also generally, I have a Twitter, but generally I do kind of talks and lectures, and I'm writing a new book on revenge and dangerous obsessions, where I'll be looking at fun topics like erotomania and women who stalk and the kind of disastrous consequences that can have for their victims and also for them. So
Okay.
I think those are the best places.
All right, we'll keep an eye out for that, and we'll put some links in the description for everyone to check out. And last of all, Anna, I'd just like to know, what do you think about changes in the the prison system, the judicial system that you would like to see based on all of your experience?
Well, I'd really like to see lots more community provision for young girls and women at risk of becoming criminally exploited. And for example, in the UK, there's a brilliant colleague of mine called Alia Ali, who has a project called Daddyless Daughters. And that's very interesting because we talk a lot about men and boys being impacted by the absence of fathers. But her organization looks at the impact on girls and young women of not having father figures in their lives of fathers, and how much that leads to them being much more vulnerable to being criminally exploited, getting into gangs and sexual exploitation, as well as other forms of quite serious violence. So I think community provision is hugely important. Also, conditions within prison, so having real trauma-informed therapeutic interventions in prisons, not life without parole, certainly not the death penalty, but these are controversial areas, I realize. But I would like to see criminal justice systems that really understand the unique needs of women and girls and are able to divert women from prison wherever possible, although the most dangerous and violent women do need to be incarcerated. But when that happens, to have environments that really can provide the necessary treatment, educational, occupational facilities that can support proper rehabilitation.
All right. Well, Anna Motz, thank you for your really nuanced look at so many of these issues, violence and all of these things with incarceration and the justice system and everything, and for your book, and for taking this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Brad. It's been fascinating and quite challenging at moments, which made me think, which is great.
Good. Thanks for watching my interview. To go even deeper on these ideas, you can watch my episode on female psychopaths with Dr. Fiona Gherkin using the link in the description or the box on the screen.